2, 3, 4. So may we start?
Annette is probably one of the year's craziest films. The eighth feature from legendary French auteur Carax is a musical collaboration with suitably eccentric pop duo Sparks, and it crams a whole lot into its runtime. But above everything else this musical odyssey has to offer, I find myself absolutely fascinated with Carax's fixation on theatricality. To be clear, this obviously shouldn't come as any surprise to Carax fans already. It was a theatrical film is hardly a remotely innovative way to analyse any Carax film. Heck, his entire filmography has woven its way through themes of performance and theatrics for the good part of 40 years. Nothing new there. But with each watch of Annette, I'm drawn to the very specific way in which Carax navigates and interrogates the spaces of theatricality, more specifically the performer-audience relationships at play within those spaces, and how he uses this to signal and establish the characters of his world. Before we dive much further, there are obviously going to be some pretty hefty spoilers for Annette from now on, so if you've yet to watch the film, maybe just give this one a skip, or even better, it's now streaming on Mubi, so you've literally got no excuse. Go get caught up, enjoy Adam Driver's butt, and then come back here when you're ready. Good? Good. This quote from theatre critic Richard Hornby sums up nicely the differing relationship at the heart of two types of performance. A suggestion that live theatre audiences are reactive, where a camera, and by extension the film audience, is more passive. Now Hornby writes obviously from an actor's perspective there, but I think his words have just as much meaning in relation to how we view as an audience. He later describes camera in film as, quote, a surrogate audience. But what happens when you view a reactive audience through a passive camera? This is pretty much at the heart of what I find so captivating about Annette. Carax's decision to frame the film within differing worlds of live performance, bringing live audiences directly into the film world, places us within those theatrical environments that Hornby asserts as a more reactive forms of viewership, opening up the perfect space to understand the film's characters in the context of Carax and Sparks' thesis. And the characters of Annette are absolutely integral in navigating this thesis. An exploration of the seductive and destructive nature of fame and celebrity through passion, power, and exploitation. Jens Eder envisions quite broadly characters as, quote, identifiable represented beings with an inner life that exist as communicatively constructed artifacts. So how does Carax construct his artifacts to serve the film's central themes? Let's look at three central characters of the film, each with their own unique performance space, to interrogate how audiences illuminate their motives and functions within the world of Annette. Henry, played by Adam Driver, often in a dressing gown, occasionally with his butt out, channels Carax's most obviously damning critique of fame. A stand-up comedian who craves attention and control, and ultimately spirals that into a destructive obsession that sees him kill his wife and exploit his daughter. Super fun guy. Our initial introduction to Henry through one of his sold-out stand-up routines perfectly establishes a man obsessed with control, riding the high of fame. Backstage, he punches air in a dressing gown. We follow him on stage through smoke, audience hidden from view, and there's this feeling of confrontation, like we're about to watch Henry beat the shit out of something. Of course, it's just an elaborate stage entrance from an egotistical performer, which in itself speaks volumes of Henry's relationship with the paying audience he's about to entertain, a fight he hopes to win. And this is a thread that crops back up later in the film too.
How did the show go?
I killed them.
But the rest of the sequence unfolds as this kind of fascinating blend of musical number and comedy routine. Sparks' music here and Driver's stand-up flow seamlessly between and into each other. So much so it's not always really clear exactly what's what there. The first quick burst of music plays like a part of his set.
Yes, why should I activate your ventral medial prefrontal cortex so your 15 facial muscles will contract, so your fucking zygomatic muscle will react?
But the musical interjections progressively start to feel more realised. With backing singers that feel a part of the film's language, you can even hear glimmers of the Sparks brothers' voices in the film's musical language here.
So why did you become a comedian? For the fame?
No.
And the distinction is almost never really clarified. No doubt an intentional decision, which itself acts as a deconstruction of performance versus reality, but again blurs what's intended for the audience within the film and what's intended for the audience watching the film. And the audience is an absolutely integral presence within this entire sequence. Hornby's position that the stage actor feeds off the audience is perhaps never explored more clearly than this opening introduction to Henry. There's a real sense of symbiosis flowing through the entire sequence, as Henry orders his audience to laugh, or as his audience directly questions him back.
Why did you become a comedian for the women?
Carax establishes a two-way relationship here between performer and audience, a constant push-pull of manipulation and manipulating, but ultimately one which has a dominant figure. Despite the chaotic, adrenaline-filled nature of the performance, there's never really any doubt that Henry is thriving in absolute control here. Anne's introduction, then, is surely the other side of the coin. There is a palpable sense of attention and respect from her audience, but there's also this sense that Anne is almost being controlled. The very first shot we see of Anne on stage is actually dropped directly into Henry's first stand-up sequence. Its placement here in the edit, along with the visual image of her sort of hiding on stage, alone, hidden from the distant audience, which is very, very far in the background, suggests an immediately very direct parallel in the visuals with Henry's more commanding stage presence. And when we finally do get to see her opera performance, Anne's music feels more calm, more melancholy. Exacerbated, obviously, by Sparks' choice to lean into opera, but Carax, as a director, heightens this in his presentation of the different spaces too. In Henry's stand-up world, the audience is immediately much more prominent, intentionally lit, interrupting the edit and the scene. But here we're given no more than 2 shots. It's a striking distinction that quickly establishes a more traditional performance space here, a natural extension, I think, of Anne's profession versus Henry's profession, an audience that watches but doesn't interject. But secondly, it sets up the beginning of a binary tension between the two performers, one energetic, one collected, one of disruption, one of tradition, one of anger, and one of fear. The pointed silence of Anne's audience is, of course, a direct result of the difference in the way an audience might watch an opera versus stand-up, but it's also, in the context of the film, a telling signpost of her isolation and paranoia. A thread that we'll see manifest later in the film through dreams of Henry's crimes against women, and that will ultimately prove true as she ends up, murdered at the peak of Henry's spiral. If Henry and Anne's audience in their initial introductions serve as indicators of their primary relationships with fame and celebrity, just as illuminating, I think, is the way their audiences change through the film. Henry's second stand-up routine is an entirely different beast to the first one we see, and it signposts his ultimate meltdown as a result of the power that he craves from fame. The audience this time around takes on a much more hostile role that signals the shifting dynamic between Henry and the people that give him his power through fame. Notice the different way Carax shoots the audience. The shots of the audience as a unified, swaying whole are swapped out for closer, more personal shots. A visual evolution as the audience gains more agency in this space. The lighting starts to bring in hues of gold, which give individual faces much more luminance and much more prominence, and the interjections that seemed good nature in the opening routine
and different late opera style
now feel much more hostile. So if the first time we meet Henry on stage felt like a performer winning a fight, this feels much more like a man losing. It's heightened as well by a shift in the way Carax's camera views the fight. The traditional coverage of Henry on stage versus audience watching from the stalls begins to break down a little bit, and we get more shots that frame them both together. Lots of shots over his shoulder, looking down and facing and antagonizing the body of people that are essentially the reason he's there in the first place. Forgive me for this wanky line, but Henry is quite literally facing the fame that will eventually be his destruction. And that audience will only continue to evolve through the film, leaving the space of the theatre into Henry's life. The police that interrogate him after Anne's death, the protesters that line the streets, and the court that decides his fate. These story moments work even more effectively knowing where Henry's relationship with the audience, with this chorus in the film, originated. At no point is there any real escape for him from the eyes of the people that will decide his success and eventually decide his demise. And so too does Anne's audience evolve, albeit in a different way. Anne's story sees her retracting out of the audience on stage, and then later sees her retracting out of the public eye. I mean, she literally escapes from everyone on a boat in the ocean. And as she begins to isolate herself further, her audience begins to narrow, as she escapes the constructed world of the stage into a more literal wooded environment. It's an obviously very surreal moment, but it's a fascinating transition as well from stage language to film language. much, giving Anne her voice when she's alone with the camera and by extension with the film audience. This continues later in the film as well. While Henry's having a meltdown on stage, Anne sings to herself, to her baby. The audience moves from a literal audience in a theatre space to a kind of figurative audience in herself. But the sense of performance is crucially never lost there, propped up obviously by Sparks' theatrical music sensibilities and by the very language of the musical film itself that sees performers singing and dancing in spite of the lack of any actual, literal audience before them. So if Henry and Anne's audiences exist to show obsession and isolation, respectively, what are we to make of baby Annette's? Annette's performance and relationship with her audience feels like a natural hybrid of everything Carax has set up before through her parents' performances. And by combining elements of the two, he suggests not just a visual link between her and her parents, but also suggests a natural consequence to her parents' approaches to fame and celebrity. In the world of Annette, exploitation is framed as an inevitability of fame. Right from the get-go, she's being watched by the crowd, this time through their phone screens as well, suggesting an even greater presence outside of the theatre space. And Henry also takes on the role of the audience here as well, watching from the wings, reminiscent of the way he watched Anne at different points through the film before. And Carax crucially uses all of this to build pressure in Annette's relationship with her audience. And then Carax makes arguably one of the boldest choices in a film of a lot of bold choices, at least in terms of the audiences we've been allowed to see so far. He lets the camera linger in close-up on the people that are actually watching Annette. Children. Real children. An immediate contrast to the very much not real puppet that's performing on stage for them. There's a bitter sweetness to this image, and in fact I'd argue it's one of the film's most poignant moments, especially because Carax lingers on the faces so much. There's an honesty to the youth on display here, which is brilliantly juxtaposed against the theatricality of the adult audience before. But Annette's function in the film's musings on fame is also highlighted by the way her audience evolves, paralleling but also juxtaposing her parents' audiences before her. From stage to stadium, her audience literally grows between the two performances we're shown. And with this, they seem to lose individual agency as the world tightens its grip on Annette, just as she's never been allowed that agency in the first place. Reflected again in the way Carax presents this performance. Gone are the close-ups of children, and instead we only really see her audience as a mass, unidentifiable in a sea of phone lights. A change from personal to collective, signposting again Carax and Sparks' comments on the innate relationship between growing fame and exploitation. But also an interesting contrast, I think, with the way in which her parents' evolving audiences felt so personal to their characters. Anne moving inward, and Henry grappling with control. Here though, the evolution feels separate from Annette's own desires as a character. And in fact, she's never really given the ability to entertain those desires anyway, until the very final scene of the film. A further comment itself on the way she's controlled and exploited through the lens of fame. So back to the original question. How does Carax construct his artifacts to serve the film's central themes? There's so much at play in Annette that I don't think it would ever really be truly possible to answer that one concisely. But the audience is unavoidable at every stage of this story. They are an essential tool in building Henry, Anne and Annette. Even when the film moves out of the traditionally signified spaces of performance, Carax is constantly reminding us of the relationships at the heart of performance that Hornby was so interested in earlier. But perhaps here it's more fluid. Perhaps the distinction in the world of Annette is not quite as binary as passive or reactive audiences. Instead, the audience and performers are in a constant dance of power and control, shifting as characters try to wrestle the world of fame and celebrity and the pressures that come with that. The audience, as a product of fame, offer different paths for our characters, but there's an underlying tragedy here that Carax keeps coming back to over and over again. That despite our characters' best efforts to avoid it, the temptations, the paranoia, and the exploitation of celebrity bring them all back down into an unavoidable abyss.